All right, thank you all so much for joining. We're here with another episode of the Grow Rogue podcast. Today, I'm joined by Carlos Valdes-Dapena. Carlos actually was with me in my old podcast. A lot of you may be familiar with it. It was the Growth Secrets podcast back pre-COVID and right during COVID. And Carlos has a pretty bold statement that I am going to ask him a ton of questions about. He says, we're doing teamwork wrong. So I want to know, what does that actually mean and what are we supposed to do about it? So if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. And if you're watching this on another platform, thank you so much for joining us. Make sure to share this with your network and your community. So without further ado, Carlos, thanks for joining me today. Today, I'm really excited to bring back a guest who joined me on my old podcast, the Growth Secrets podcast, Carlos Valdes-Dapena. And Carlos, he makes a bold claim that we're doing team building incorrectly. We're doing it wrong. And so I'm excited to talk to him today about how we can do that right and how we can grow our organizations through better team building, and a lot of other wisdom that I'm sure Carlos is going to drop. Carlos, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate you being a part of this.
Delighted to be with you and with you again, Reed.
Awesome. Well, tell us about that. So again, you make this bold claim. You think we're doing teamwork and team building wrong. Why do you think that is? And what do you think we should do about it?
Well, I risk ticking off a lot of my colleagues who work with teams and do team development by saying what I say, especially when we get particular about it, as I'm about to. But I'm going to go ahead anyway, because I think part of being in business is you have to take reasonable risks that serve what you believe is the direction you want to go, right? To serve your vision. So much of what passes for team building, Reed, is based on getting folks together, getting to know each other, and having a good time together. That's team building. Now, sometimes that'll look like going out and preparing a meal together, which is a lovely thing to do. I don't want anybody to think that I'm a Scrooge about this. I don't want to stop people from enjoying each other's company or even learning about each other. So we'll do a Myers-Briggs, or we'll do, if you're familiar with that personality instrument, there's also the DISC is another personality instrument. Tick on down the list. And we come to understand each other better. There's an assumption built into these generic team building processes, which is that if we get to know each other better, we'll work better together. It sort of seems reasonable, right? If I understand your preferences, if I understand your style, well, then you and I can have a more productive working relationship. And that's not all it takes to be good collaborators. Because remember, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is work together to produce an outcome. Yeah? We want to create value through our collaboration. That requires more than mutual understanding. And so what my team and I did when I was working at Mars Incorporated, where we developed this methodology and this philosophy, really, what we did was look at what does it take to get motivated individuals who are used to being recognized and rewarded for their individual contributions. What does it really take to get them to work productively as a team? What does it really take? We know that part of it is, yes, I want to build comfort in my relationship with you, but a bigger part of it is answering some really simple, almost stupidly simple questions like, so what is it that we expect of our collaboration? So why will this be better because you and I did it together than it would be if you did it by yourself and just called me if you needed a hand here or there, right? What is the expected value add of the collaborative enterprise? We don't ask that question. We just say, let's work together and see what happens. It's about clarity of intent. Now, whether you're running a business or raising kids or trying to have a productive collaborative relationship, clarity of intent is so very important. So getting really clear about the why of this collaboration, why do we think we need to work together, whether it's 2 people, 3 people, or a whole team? What specifically do we need to collaborate on? And what does success look like when we've done that? And then making some agreements within that. How should we work with each other? What are you good at? What am I good at? What skills do you have I don't have? What preferences do I have that we could exercise in the service of this joint outcome that you don't have to worry about because I got that, right? Those kind of conversations, and they're not sexy and they're not necessarily fun, but they're really helpful and they really change outcomes, which is what I'm all about. So that's really what's different.
Well, no, that makes a lot of intuitive sense, right? It's counterintuitive because you're right. We don't tend to do that, but it does make a lot of intuitive sense in that, hey, well, we're here for a reason. Well, let's define what that reason is and what are we going to do as our roles in that. So how do we formalize that, or do we formalize that, right? How do you implement this within an organization? And does it matter if it's a small business, mid-sized business, or big business?
I was just on the phone with a client of mine who is relatively new to a large organization, stepping into a role around leadership and people development in this big organization. And she wanted to adopt this methodology that we created at Mars. And she said, what I love about this is it's scalable. So individual teams can take this methodology and use it for themselves. And I can teach people how to use this methodology so they can teach others how to use this methodology, and we can scale it up. Also scalable in the sense that it can be used for a team of 3, or it can be used for a team of 30, which some would question, is a team of 30 really a team? I get it. But the other thing I've learned, Reed, is if people want to call it a team, I just let them call it a team. I'm not going to debate with you over what's a so-called real team and what's not a real team. The key is, where's the collaboration need to happen and how can we make the most of it? Whether you call it a team or a group or a committee, right? So it's highly scalable and it's learnable. That's the other thing I like about it. Now, there's a secret psychological sauce behind it all. We can talk about that. But that theory which underpins this approach is interesting. But what matters is that we give you tools and a methodology and a map to follow to get your team where you want them, and let the psychology take care of itself. So yeah, I think, let me now get to the heart of the question. The key to this is answering questions I've already raised here with you. The first is, what's the why of our collaboration? Why is our collaboration really important? What is the value we hope to create through collaboration that will be greater than the value we would create by just adding up our individual contributions, right? Because you and I could each do a job, and our boss could then take the outputs of that, and we could make progress. Collaboration's messy. It gets complicated because it involves people and relationships, and people can be unpredictable and emotional and all kinds of stuff. So if you want to get in collaboration, you got to be ready to deal with that, and you've got to know that it's worth the added effort and energy it takes to collaborate. So that why answers the question. Why is it worth our collaboration? Why will our collaboration have a greater payoff than just getting some individuals to do this as individuals? Now, part of that why is also the context you're operating in. You need to understand, we don't collaborate just because we think it's fun or a good idea. We collaborate in response to an external driving force, right? There's a strategic demand on our group, or there's a customer need, right? That's the reality. We're never doing it in a vacuum. So get your context clear, and then sit down with your collaborative partners and say, let's get our why clear. Let's make sure we all have the same reasons for this. At least in part, our reasons align. We may not all be motivated in exactly the same way, but we have overlapping needs that meet around this collaboration. That's really critical to have that conversation, the why, within the context of the bigger need. And then you get specific and say, okay, if that's the why of our collaboration, what are we going to work on together specifically? Because, every project you go to work on, Reed, has bits and pieces, parts, component elements to it. Big pieces, small pieces that you need to put together. Some lie in a critical path. Some can be put on parallel paths and brought together later, whatever it may be. Subdivide the work and figure out where the collaboration really needs to happen. Some stuff may not need collaboration. And that's the other thing about this methodology. We want to liberate people from feeling like they have to be a team about everything. You don't. Where can your individual gifts, talents, creativity be perfectly fine just with you running the show? Because that's really very efficient, isn't it? Right? You don't need to do a lot of interaction. You can put on the express track the work you're going to do by yourself. Some work, though, is more complex than that, requires collaboration. Great. Let's focus our collaborative efforts where that will really pay off. And let's let great individuals do great individual work where that's the appropriate thing to do. And boy, that can be liberating for teams, especially if you're in a big business where the teamwork mantra is constantly chanted. God, sometimes you just want to go get on with it, right? Give me my individual objectives and let me just go for it. Super. Let's do that where it makes sense.
Yeah, and I really want to dig into this piece. You talk about freeing them up to not have to do the teamwork thing, right? Because it's really clear, right? Let's say in a sports environment, right, where there are specific times where one player has the ball. And the best thing for the other teammates to do is to get the heck out of the way, right? There's that famous play from Michael Jordan where the coach in the press conference after, they say, hey, how'd you draw up that play? Or what was the play you drew up? And he said, well, it's get the ball to Michael and everybody else get the out of the way, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes that's the appropriate thing to do.
Correct.
But we feel this almost like a guilt if we're trying to be quote unquote good teammates or to be a good team member is, hey, let's do everything together, when that's not always the appropriate thing to do. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. And it's in, I have this poster I have one of these motivational posters on my wall here in my office. You can't see it because it's above my camera here. But, the one with the rowers at sunset, and it says teamwork emblazoned across the bottom, and it's very cool and very sexy. And and you'll see the word team emblazoned on shirt. It's all over the place. And so there's this subtle expectation that we'll be a good team player. Well, whatever that means. In my book called Lessons from Mars, I talk about what passes for teamwork is what I call teaminess. People want to feel teamy. They want to feel like we feel that buzz of we're together and it's cool and we're comrades and we're trying to take the same hill at the same time in the same way. That's a really nice feeling, that feeling of teaminess. But is it actually contributing to getting you the better outcome you want, right? That requires a deeper level of work. That requires the kinds of stuff we've talked about. And by the way, once you've got your why clear and your what clear, then you got to sit down with each other and have the kind of conversations you have around contracting for who's going to do what and when, and then what you'll do to bring those various pieces together. So it goes a level deeper. That teamwork involves, whether we like it or not, just the willingness to roll up your sleeves and have some of the tough conversations you need to have when you're working with others. And sometimes, Reed, in bigger organizations, we don't get to work with the people we like. Sometimes it's our colleagues, sometimes it's our boss. And we have to find ways to have the discussions with people that we need to have in order to work through the uncomfortable moments that will undoubtedly arise. That's why preparing for collaboration in the way I've described sets you up for greater success, because we've already figured out the why. We figured out the what. Now we've hit a bump in the road. All right, let's just sit down for a second. Let's reground ourselves and where we're coming from, why we're doing it. I know we don't necessarily get along, but we got to do it together. So let's remember what we're about. It can go a long way to deal with some of the conflict that inevitably comes up in a collaborative relationship, which I think is really important. Because if there isn't conflict in a productive relationship, you're probably not doing it right. If everybody agrees on everything all the time, watch out, right? Because you may be marching towards an outcome that isn't really what you need, versus the healthy activity that arises from what I call productive conflict, because we have two different views.
Okay, let's talk about that for a second. I think that's great, right? Because, anybody that's been a part of an organization, whether successful or not, you have been through that really kind of awkward, uncomfortable, frustrating period where maybe things just aren't going right. And the plan that was such a brilliant plan 6 weeks ago or 6 months ago, it's not working, right? And so then what do we do then? Just like you're describing, right? What happens when we hit a bump in the road? And then I've got an interesting other thought to this, or an additional thought to this, is who is the best person to lead that discussion, right? What is the right way to do that? And then who is the right person to lead that? So I'll kind of just give you that question and see what you do with that, because that to me is where it gets cloudy for a lot of organizations.
Well, look, I think if you're doing the job in the way that I and others I've worked with would recommend, we don't leave conflict as a topic to discuss when it happens. We're starting out of the gate knowing, because we're in a high pressure situation. We have expectations to deliver, right? There's a deadline, probably. There's a budget. There are all kinds of constraints we have to work within, right? We can't afford to wait until we have a falling out to tackle some of our differences. We want to put those on the table right up front. So in that why conversation, you're going to notice in the why conversation with your collaborative colleagues some different motivators, some different reasons people think it's important to work together. Great. Let's log those and take note of them. Then when we get to the next stage, the what conversation, some people are going to think this is what we need to work on together, and that over there could be done individually. Others might say, no, I don't agree. I think we need to work. So you're going to see these differences start to surface early. And so the next stage of this, which is this contracting thing I've suggested has to happen, once we've defined our collaborative landscape, then we've got to sit down and say, okay, how are we going to work together? And within that conversation, let's talk about how we deal with differences when they come up, because they will come up. And let's be ready and have an agreement. So one of the agreements could be, if conflict arises, the one who calls it out is the one who's going to set up and facilitate the conversation, and we'll agree that that conversation will be done in the context of our agreed what and our agreed why, right? And we'll have these ground rules. We'll put in place 4 or 5 behavioral ground rules: mutual respect, deep listening, curiosity and inquisitiveness around how we got here. So plan for it. Assume it's going to happen and plan for it. I don't know who leads it is part of the answer, part of the question to ask. So if in this case I've said the person who identifies it and calls it out. You might also have an agreement that says, look, if we really feel stuck, we're going to go to this person over here who's going to help us if we're in that conflict. Again, the key to this is anticipating the differences and the tensions and having at least a roadmap. That might fail you in the moment. Reality intervenes, and we've had all these great thoughts about how we'll deal with conflict, but we're so ticked off at each other that it falls by the wayside. It happens. It's the exception, not the rule, however. What we found is people generally, if they've done this process I've described, they'll generally find themselves able to handle conflict in productive ways and not let simmering resentment get in the way, because we've tried to anticipate where we think it's going to come up, and we've built some channels through which to put it. Does that help?
Well, I mean, that's huge, right? If you have let's say this not the backup plan, that's not the right word, but this is the process that we're all going to agree to here in the beginning, that, hey, when issues arise or when we have a conflict, this is the action plan for dealing with that. Yep. And I think, to your point, that actually takes the pressure off of, maybe even the leader, whoever that is, whatever that title is, but it could be the person who identifies. And if we've all agreed to, hey, when there's an issue, this is what you do. You sound the alarm and we go through these steps right here. Is that what you're describing?
Yeah, exactly. Some people would call it a protocol. We have a conflict protocol. It's a language I learned from some of my mentors in the team development space. Let's have a conflict protocol. One of the very common elements of that protocol could be, if you don't raise it in 24 hours, you let it go, right? So we put some time boundaries on it. I have found that's a difficult one to honor. Often some people who are more introverted will sit with stuff for longer, but you play with it in a way that's appropriate for you. Another one is no triangulation. Now that's a concept that suggests if you and I are working for the same person, Reed, and I'm having issues with the way you're going about whatever it is, I come to you. I don't go to my boss and say, that Reed guy, he's just such a pain in the neck. He can't do anything right now. My commitment is, no, I don't triangulate. I don't go up to the boss and then back down to you. I come right to you. And so simple little agreements like that can be a good start. I find you start collaborating deeper in a team. So sometimes there's some very few things that a total team will want to work on together. Often, for example, that'll be a strategy. We're going to develop a strategy for our business, right? And we're going to come together on that. We're all bought into it. We've all contributed to it. We've all shaped it. That's an important full team collaboration. But a lot of collaboration in teams happens at the level of 2 or 3 players. Yeah. And there you got to it's worth getting personal. Like, here's how, when conflict comes up, here's how I tend to react. And so in order for us to handle that, let's build in this part of a protocol that'll account for my personality quirks, right? So be willing to get that personal about it. Believe me, it's going to be so worth it when the time comes.
Now, that makes a ton of sense. And I actually, it's starting to make sense to me. Good.
Okay. I'm not totally confusing you.
It's starting to make sense to me how this can be practically applied, right? And admittedly, and I always give this disclaimer, right? I run a marketing agency. I'm a sales and marketing guy. I'm a hammer, and I'm looking for a nail. And so whenever I come across a new concept, and as a business owner, as an entrepreneur, I try to find out, well, how can this thing, I heard a mentor of mine told me to ask yourself this question is, does it make the boat go faster, right? And if it doesn't make the boat go faster, then it's not worth your time as an entrepreneur. So
right.
I'm trying to find, okay, how does this make the boat go faster. And I'm starting to see how this really applies to growing an organization, right? Because you're going to have these moments as a team. Building a team and adding talented team members, that's one thing. But having a bunch of talented people work together towards a specific objective also looks great on paper. But what do you do when the inevitable hiccup arises? And so I'd like to talk for a second about how we kind of leverage your methodology within an organization that is oriented towards growth, whether that's sales growth, whether that's some other area, even potentially in a nonprofit environment, right, where we're talking about growing awareness, or we're trying to build a brand or something like that. I'd like to almost war game this, right? Carlos, you are the new chief operating officer at this organization, and you've got a team of 12 to 15, I'm going to selfishly use the example, sales and marketing people, and they're all super talented, but we're not, and they may be individually doing a really good job, but we're not hitting these overall growth goals. What's the first thing you do to right the ship? I'm really curious to hear your answer.
So this is a good one. One of my favorite stories is about working with one of my client teams when I was internal at Mars, who were the sales team for Walmart. And you're dealing with, in the Mars business, you had 3 lines of business. You had pet products, pet food. You had the candy that everybody's so familiar with, Snickers and M&Ms, Wrigley's gum. And then you had a small food business, Ben's Original Rice, formerly Uncle Ben's, now Ben's Original, all living together down in Bensonville, Arkansas, I guess it is. Yeah, down where Walmart's headquartered, had their own little building and office. And they had this growth target of like 6% overall for the Mars business, including all 3 segments. And each of those various segments had its target. So the food business, the rice business, had like a 20% growth target because they were on a small base, right? You had the pet, and the candy, which is more mature, and they're together with maybe 3 or 4% each. But when you added up the revenue, they wanted to net out at like 5% growth year on year. Okay. And they were all charged up to do this. And they said, we're going to be a great team. We're going to go get this growth, and we're going to make Mars proud. Well, lo and behold, they do their planning, they launch the year, and they end up with like a point above. They're like 6% growth for the year, and they're celebrating their great teamwork. And they wanted to build on this and brought me in to say, well, next year we're going to do even better because we're going to make our teamwork better. And it wasn't in reaction to a negative. It was actually trying to build on a positive. And so I said, great, well, let's talk about last year. And so I got told this story, and I said, okay, so tell me, in terms of that, you set this very aggressive goal, and then you all went out and you did your thing. Where was the teamwork in there? They said, well, the rice guys did a great thing with the rice, and they really their displays and their in-store marketing and promotions were great. And then the pet people did their thing, and that was great. And I said, so it sounds like what happened here was each individual went off and pursued his target, and it all added up to the right number. Great. But is that teamwork? That really teamwork? That's individuals pursuing individual goals. I call that additive, the fallacy of additive collaboration. Just because individual efforts add up to a number doesn't mean you're a great team. I said, where might you have missed opportunities to cross-promote? I'm going to have my lovely rice dinner. What about having Snickers as part of the dessert? Where did you miss an opportunity to actually work across those lines, to collaborate towards even greater opportunity because you chose to cross those lines? And it's a very common mistake people make. It's that added up, you get the right number, and you miss, because you're so motivated individually, you miss the potential that lies in crossing the boundaries and saying, hey, what if we put this with that and added this? What do we get? Now, it's not necessarily an easy answer, and it's not always even the right answer. Sometimes you're going to say, you know what? Never mind. Let's keep our individual silos in their silos and let them do the great work they do. Sometimes that is the right choice. But if you're looking for a real unlocker, it can often lie in trying to put together 2 pieces. Rice and gum, how do those fit together? I don't know. Let's ask. Let's inquire. How could we do in-store work with the vendor, work with our Walmart colleagues, and figure out a way to make the most of our brands across the various aisles they sit in? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. And to me, I'd translate this as especially and back to the example, right? The example was, let's say we've got a bunch of motivated, talented people, but they're not particularly interested in working together, right? They're just doing their own thing. They feel like
Yeah.
they can hit their own goals. It's about helping to identify where the not just where the gaps are, but where the greater opportunity could be
Right.
in working together a little bit more collaboratively. And I think as a leader, what we have to be able to do is to figure out how to align incentives and make sure that people see that there is an even greater outcome on the other side of working together. That might not always be working together, to your point, right? It might be to say, hey, look, we have evaluated and we have determined that the best thing to do is to maybe invest in the individuals and in helping them to do their thing better. But in a lot of ways, what I would imagine is that once you hit a certain ceiling, or there's going to be a ceiling, right, where you say, hey, look, that we can't have these individuals, they can't be any more optimal, right? They're pretty much maxing out their potential in this role. Now we have to figure out a way to make 1 + 1 = 3.
Yeah. And so you look for that, and it's got to be real, right? You can't have fantasy programs that you think might work. Got to have them data to support it. But once you do, because remember, we're dealing with really motivated, in this case, salespeople, right? Who love to sell. They love to hit the numbers. They love to drive those numbers up. Don't distract those incredibly focused, outcome-oriented people with phony collaboration. What a shame that would be. It's got to feel real. It's got to feel like, yeah, I get that. I get that. I can buy into that. I'm willing to invest the extra time and energy it's going to take to do that, because I think it'll actually feed my sense of achievement and my sense of success.
I think this is great. So I think the message for leaders is to evaluate your own organization and ask, are we filled with phony collaboration, teaminess? I love that term that you use, right? You feel like you're being a good team player, but you're really just kind of doing some feel good isms that don't actually contribute to the greater goal. And then figure out if your organization, if those individuals within the organization, do they need to be collaborating more? Do we need to find ways to align incentives so they work together? Or do they need to be set free from that teaminess and that phony collaboration so that the roles are well defined enough so that those individuals can really kind of push themselves to grow? So that seems like, was that fair enough to kind of boil that down into a few different like layers of questions for a leader to then evaluate?
That's a very good synopsis. Well said.
Awesome. Well, Carlos, this has been an awesome conversation. I can't thank you enough for joining me a second time. Before we hit record, Carlos and I were talking about just the last time we spoke when we did the Growth Secrets podcast interview. It was pre-COVID. So it's been several years, but it might as well have been a different world ago. So I'm so glad to be able to reconnect with you, Carlos. I'm really excited to share this and for everybody to get to be reintroduced to this conversation. And before we do close, do you mind just sharing how people can learn more about you, how they can follow you and get in touch with you?
Well, sure. You can find me on LinkedIn, Carlos Valdes-Dapena. That's where you'll find me on LinkedIn, or on my website, which is Carlos V. Dapena. Reed, I'm guessing you'll have some graphics or something you can pop in there with some of this with my website. So yeah, either through LinkedIn or through my website, and just reach out, and I'm a pretty responsive guy. So I'd love to get in conversation with more of you out there.
And Carlos, you're absolutely right. We will have all those links in the description. If you're watching this on YouTube, check out those links. Also, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. It really helps us a ton. And if you're watching this on LinkedIn or Facebook, make sure you like and share this with your network. There may be somebody in there that this is going to be really helpful for, and you can be the one to get that in front of them. So do that for your community. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you all on the next one. Thanks.